Welcome to this event. I'm Sanjeev Arora, Director of Princeton Language and Intelligence, which is a unit that works on artificial intelligence on campus, and it started in 2023. Today's event is about consciousness and potentially whether it could arise in AI models. And one thing I can add here is, which may be very relevant, is that currently you think of AI as this language model, or like ChatGPT, but the next wave of models that will hit, probably within weeks or months, will be able to, not only understand images, which many models do right now, but also video and speech, etc. So, and they might also be able to generate speech. And so then today's topic starts to become even more relevant. They have all the sensory perceptions as well. So can they be conscious? All right, so I'll just introduce the moderator for today's event, and then I'll hand over the stage to him. Our moderator is Anil Ananthaswamy. He's an award-winning science writer, and he has been in various positions, including deputy news editor for the New Scientist magazine in London. And he has been, he's a freelance writer whose works appears regularly in the magazines New Scientist, Quanta, Scientific American, Proceeding of National Academy of Sciences, and Nature. He's also an award-winning book writer. His first book, The Edge of Physics, was voted the Book of the Year in 2010 by UK's Physics World. And his second book, which is very relevant to today's topic, The Man Who Wasn't There, was longlisted for the Penn O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. And his most recent book from last year, his next book, Through Two Doors at Once, which was about quantum mechanics, was named one of Smithsonian's favorite books of 2018, and one of Forbes' best books about astronomy, physics, and mathematics. And his latest book from last year, Why Machines Learn, The Elegant Math Behind Modern AI, was published last year to rave reviews. So I'll hand over the stage to Anil Ananthaswamy. Please welcome him, and he'll tell us about the event.
Thank you for that introduction, Sanjeev. It's a pleasure to be here. And welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. We are here, as Sanjeev said, to discuss what might seem like both a frivolous question and an incredibly profound one. Will machines become conscious? And to help us discuss and debate the question, we have with us two eminent researchers. Before I give you a little bit of background about the topic of discussion, let me just introduce both of them. To my immediate left is Professor Dave Chalmers. He's a university professor of philosophy and neuroscience and co-director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness at New York University. Among other things, he works on the philosophy of mind, particularly at the intersection of cognitive science, physics, and technology, and is also the author of many books written for the broader public, particularly his first, The Conscious Mind, his most recent one being Reality Plus, Virtual Worlds and the Problem of Philosophy. He is very well known as the person who coined the phrase, the hard problem of consciousness, which I suspect will come up during the course of the discussion. Dave was also occasionally the lead singer of the Zombies blues band. The zombies here refers to philosophical zombies? Mm-hmm. Yes. And we also have with us Professor Michael Graziano. He is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Princeton. His lab works on the brain basis of consciousness, in particular on testing his mechanistic theory of consciousness called the attention schema theory. Michael, too, has written many popular science books, most notably Consciousness and the Social Brain, and is also a novelist, writing for both adults and children. The children's books are under a pseudonym. Apparently, he doesn't want to scare them or something like that. I'm not sure. And to keep up with Dave's status as the lead singer of a blues band, Michael is a composer who has written scores for string quartets and symphonies. I got to know Michael at a conference in Tucson, where I saw him doing a bit of ventriloquism. So he also does some ventriloquism using his puppet or orangutan, Kevin, to make a point about how we perceive others and how we attribute consciousness to others. I wanted him to bring the puppet, but then the puppet would have stolen the show completely. So he keeps it back in his office. So now I'll briefly, so welcome Dave, welcome Michael, it's a pleasure to have you both. I will briefly introduce today's topic before I ask them for their opening statements. So many of you might remember in June 2022, what seems like a long, long time ago in AI time, a Google engineer asserted that a large language model, a chatbot named Lambda, that he was interacting with, came across as conscious to him. Google, of course, denied the claims, saying that they had tested Lambda and it was no such thing. That was almost 3 years ago. Things have moved on. We can only wonder what the engineer would have said had he encountered today's massive LLMs, such as GPT-4o, Claude, Gemini, and maybe even DeepSeek. But some of these LLMs have been fine-tuned today using reinforcement learning to not answer silly questions about their consciousness. But is it really a silly question? That's what we want to explore this evening. When we say consciousness, most people think of the entirety of human experience, the experience of our sensations such as taste, the experience of our emotions, i.e. feelings, the experience of having thoughts and being able to reason, the experience of feeling like agents of actions, and so on. And of course, awareness of being a self or self-consciousness. Consciousness might be something much simpler and paradoxically harder to explain than these aspects of our experience. So this evening, we'll start with some assumptions. As you know, if we had a discussion about the nature of consciousness, we wouldn't leave this hall for days on end. So we'll start with some assumptions that will help us remain focused. We'll assume that our experience of being conscious is an outcome of the material processes that comprise our brains and bodies. Consequently, we'll set aside ideas such as panpsychism, which claims that everything is conscious, or that there is even a hard problem of consciousness, as I said, a phrase coined by Dave. We're not necessarily setting that aside, but we'll probably not go too far down that path. So we'll be hewing to a materialist conception of consciousness. Again, we'll come to definitions in a bit. With that in mind, we'll explore what this implies for machines we are building. In particular, we'll focus on large language models such as ChatGPT. But again, towards the end, probably not towards the kind of models that Sanjeev just mentioned that are imminent. So these are large language models are machine learning systems that are trained on vast amounts of data taken off the internet. They have essentially been trained to predict the next word given some sequence of words. As these models have become bigger, in terms of the number of parameters, the amount of data they are trained on, and the amount of compute used to train them, the models have started exhibiting more and more sophisticated behavior. Will such AI ever become conscious, or are they already conscious? What would it mean to say an AI is conscious, and can the machines that we build tell us something about our own consciousness? So with all these questions in mind, I want to start by asking Dave the first question. Dave, you coined the phrase, the hard problem of consciousness. Could you tell us what you meant by that phrase, what you mean by that phrase, and give us a brief overview of ways to think about materialism and how it connects or doesn't connect to the hard problem? Maybe that will give us a definition of consciousness that we can use operationally for this discussion.
Yeah, thanks. Well, thanks for organizing this. It's a great pleasure to be here. In fact, I think I was right here in this very room about 12 months ago, giving a talk with the title "Can ChatGPT Think?" Then the topic was thought. This time it's consciousness, which really does raise distinctive, difficult questions. So let's start with the definition of consciousness. You did pretty good. The totality of human experience, including the experience of sensing, of feeling, of thinking, of acting, and maybe self-consciousness. I like a definition that my colleague in philosophy at NYU, Tom Nagel, put forward back in the 1970s in an article called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" And the idea there was, well, maybe we don't know what it's like to be a bat, but we're pretty sure there's something it is like to be a bat from the bat's perspective. There's something it feels like to be the bat, which is using sonar to find out where things are. Is it more like vision? Is it more like hearing? We can argue about that. But, there is something it's like, most of us think, to be a bat, whereas most of us would think there's not something it's like to be this table. So that's a big relevant difference between bats and tables. And we can use that to formulate a definition of consciousness. A system is conscious when there's something it's like to be that system. That's basically a matter of, does the system have subjective experience? And when it comes to this question about AI systems, then that's kind of the question that we're really fundamentally interested in. Is there something that it's like to be, for example, a large language model like GPT 4.5 or Claude or Gemini or DeepSeek? And if there's not, well, why not? First, if there's not, then why not? And but then, if not, might some successor to these systems have subjective experience? And this is tricky because subjective experience really raises distinctive problems. I mean, the whole idea of the hard problem of consciousness comes from contrasting the problem of subjective experience from other aspects of consciousness or other things that get called consciousness. Basically, in the AI framework, we might think of this as intelligence versus consciousness. Intelligence is a matter of the sophisticated behavior that human or AI systems produce. The use of language, navigating the world, at least for systems which are embodied, processing information about the environment and reporting on it, and so on, all of which are central to human intelligence. But explaining intelligence is certainly a difficult problem, but we've got a fairly straightforward paradigm for doing it. It's basically a matter of explaining certain behaviors, and you explain those by giving a neural mechanism or a computational mechanism, explaining how this system processes the environment, how it produces certain responses, how it integrates information. Very difficult questions. I mean, we're still very much in the process of unraveling these, even in the human case. But we've got a very clear research program for doing it, and no one will be surprised if in 100 years or so we've give a neural or computational explanation of the central aspects of human intelligence. But where consciousness is concerned, those are the easy problems. The hard problem is the problem of subjective experience. And one way to draw the contrast is, so even after you've explained all these behaviors, all these functions associated with intelligence, it seems that there's a further separate question. Why is all that accompanied by subjective experience? Why doesn't all this processing go on, in the dark without consciousness? So you referred to philosophical zombies. So you can also phrase the hard problem by saying, why aren't we philosophical zombies? We're not. At least I'm not. I'm conscious. I have subjective experiences. I believe that you guys have subjective experiences too. But that's a fascinating fact about our existence. How do we actually explain that fact? That's the hard problem. And it does actually become a very practical question now in the era of AI. There's a whole lot of people out there. Probably the orthodox view right now is that AI systems are not conscious, despite their behaving in very impressive ways, despite their apparent intelligence. Very, very good at behavior and intelligence. But the dominant view, I would say right now, is that they are not, they don't have subjective experience. That's to say, they're a kind of philosophical zombie. The dominant view is that ChatGPT is a philosophical zombie, Claude is a philosophical zombie, and so on. I mean, maybe not they don't have all the behaviors that humans do. They don't have bodies and so on. But I think, one thing that we're here to do is actually to throw that into question and say, is it possible that current systems have subjective experience? And if not, what do we need to do to get there? And it's hard to give definitive answers to those questions in the absence of a solution to the hard problem. But we can at least we can at least speculate about it. Some people have actually developed, theories of consciousness, which perhaps we can apply here. Anyway, I think it's certainly high time to be thinking about this question.
Great. I think that's a nice segue to Michael to have you explain one of the solutions. So you have one of the most worked out theories of the brain basis for consciousness, for how brains, as you say, arrive at the conclusion that they have an internal subjective experience of things, an experience that seems non-physical and inexplicable. You call it the attention schema theory. Tell us a bit about it, about what you mean by consciousness and how the theory explains it before we move on to machines.
Sure. And first, thank you so much. This is wonderful. It's really fun, I think, to sit here and talk about this. You asked about the puppet. He didn't want to come. He's playing video games, which tells you how far you can get without a brain at all. You're right. So consciousness, right. So yes, the attention schema theory is something that I've been working on developing since 2010, I believe. So it's been a while. And it fits within a larger framework. So it's one specific theory that fits within kind of a larger part of the intellectual landscape. And the idea, this is a theory where it is possible to build consciousness, to engineer it, to understand how it's engineered. So this is very specifically a theory that's very optimistic about AI becoming conscious, if optimistic is the right word. I don't know if it's good or bad for us to have AI become conscious, but this is a theory in which that is possible. One can then ask whether it has happened and what the steps are that are needed to get it there. But it's fundamentally a theory that says, to begin with, everything about us that we think we know, everything we talk about, everything, even if we insist intuitively, we insist we know it's true, we jump up and down swearing this is how it is, everything we know derives from information sets in our brain. Otherwise we can't think it, otherwise we can't say it. And so what we are in effect are these giant, incredible, complicated neural computation machines that have built self-models. And so when people ask me about myself, that big machine accesses its own self-models and gives answers. And the kinds of answers I give are, yes, I have consciousness. Yes, I have this subjective experience like Nagel described. Those are answers that derive from self-models that the brain constructs, and and those self-models are there for a reason. They're there because they're really useful. So any system that needs to regulate itself needs good self-models, and those self-models are often a little bit simplified. They have to be quick and easy to compute. They're a little bit schematic, and so sometimes our self-models are a little vague and we report having kind of a magical experience inside of ourselves. This is the result of having schematic, simplified self-models, but they're terribly important. They play a terribly important role in cognitive function. And so ultimately, AI systems can, in principle, have those same systems, right? So it's a very interesting question whether they should or not. I personally think it's really important to try to understand what happens when you build these systems into AI to find out what the heck the result is going to be. So it's a good idea to study this stuff. But in this framework then, in the attention schema framework, number one, just to answer the whole question of the whole evening here, number one, no. AI probably isn't conscious at this point because it doesn't have those kinds of self-models yet. Number two, yes, it can be. And number three, it's probably coming real fast. So that's the kind of larger framework that I would put this in. Yes, it's possible to build AI that has these self-models. In other words, systems that introspect and as a result are absolutely certain that they have subjective experience in the same way that our brains do it. that we introspect and become absolutely certain that we have this conscious experience. So that would be my answer.
So the evening is done. We can now go home to answer
Bye.
the questions. Yeah. So, but I know that that's not the end as far as Dave is concerned in terms of explanation. So you differ slightly, or maybe even quite a bit, from Michael's conception of a mechanistic view of how consciousness comes about. So could you elaborate a little bit while still sticking to the general materialistic framework?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, Michael and I are in some ways diametrically opposed on this problem, although I think we share some assumptions that make it quite possible for us to communicate about this. Michael's ultimately very deflationary about consciousness. His view is not far from a view which is often called illusionism, the view that consciousness is an illusion. And Michael resists that label. But there's one way I think about Michael's view is he's not exactly trying to solve directly the hard problem. Instead, he's trying to solve a problem that I call the meta problem of consciousness. And the meta problem is explaining roughly why we think there's a hard problem, why we say there's a hard problem. It's a fact about many human beings that they do get very puzzled by consciousness, even if they accept some minimal form of materialism that says, consciousness comes from the brain. It's still very mysterious and puzzling to people. Subjective experience seems to have features that make it very hard to explain. Our standard methods give a neural mechanism, give a computational mechanism. Although it works quite well on solving those easy problems, it doesn't seem to immediately tell us why there's subjective experience. That seems to be like something that's left out. So Michael's approach is don't exactly take those experiences at face value, rather take at face value the fact that humans think there's a hard problem and explain that. And he's got this very nice account in terms of attention schemas for how it is that people have got these very strong intuitions that there is subjective experience. Now, one version of this view, an extreme version of this view, is basically says, actually, nobody is conscious. Nobody has subjective experience at all. Subjective experience is just something that our brain makes up. We think we have these special properties of subjective experience. Actually, we don't. And that's I like that version of Michael's view. I mean, it's totally unbelievable that that we don't have subjective experience, because subjective experience is the most obvious thing in the world. Descartes said, this is the one thing I'm certain of. I mean, so to deny it is unbelievable. But Michael's theory, at its, at least in some versions of it, predicts that we will find it unbelievable, that there's no such thing as subjective experience. So you might say, okay, that's a point in his favor. So I actually really like illusionism as an approach to the problem of consciousness. And I think if you're really trying to give an account wholly in terms of computational mechanisms, then illusionism might be the way to go. I mean, the question is, does it explain subjective experience? Absolutely not. That's the point of the view. It's like, instead we'll just try to explain why we think there's subjective experience. For me, subjective experience is ultimately a datum. And way back at the start of all this, start of my first book, I said, I take consciousness seriously enough to think that subjective experience is a datum. And I want to give an explanation of that fact. And I think it's possible that we might be able to give explanations, at least partly in computational terms, maybe consistent with a weak form of materialism. But I do go on to argue that maybe we have to treat consciousness as a fundamental feature of the world, one that we can connect to all the other features of the world. Importantly, I don't think that excludes AI systems, for example, being conscious. I think humans are biological systems. Biological systems can be conscious. I don't see anything which is fundamentally different in principle for, say, silicon, systems. So I think all this is going to be totally consistent with AI systems being conscious. But I guess the difference between Michael and me is that I do take these facts about subjective experience as data, whereas Michael ultimately takes our judgments and the things we say about subjective experience to be the data. And that's why we end up taking these two different approaches.
Michael, you have anything to say to that, or shall we move on to?
Sure. I mean, what can I say? Yeah, I don't. You're right that that's an extreme version of what I would say. But yes, of course, we have something that you can point to and say this is subjective experience. But I also think that our semantic understanding of it is not entirely accurate. And so that's kind of where, my view begins to overlap with the illusionist view. So to say there's nothing there, it's an empty hole, it's all black, there's nothing that, there's no experience, that's just some kind of illusion. This is something that I find very irrational and hard to make sense of. So I don't think that I'm really at the extreme view that you described. But to bring it back to the machine question, yeah, I think give AI the right kinds of self-models. To me, this is the crucial component. The brain is a model builder. It builds models. Models are bundles of information that represent things in the world. It doesn't just represent things, it predicts, it complicated descriptive and predictive models of things in the world and things internally. This is what the brain does. It builds these models and it uses these models to help guide behavior, to help to make decisions, to help control itself and to help control the world around it. Give the machines the same kinds of internal models, and I think you will have machines that have the same properties that we have. And yes, maybe we have differences as to what aspect of that relates specifically to conscious experience. And I'm sure we can go down that if this were entirely about the philosophical questions of consciousness, we would spend much longer, the whole evening, talking about just that. But I would say this is the key to consciousness in machines. I would say currently the best, most sophisticated AIs that we have, which are large language models, are not doing that. So they do build models of the external world, but they don't build models of themselves in the same way, and they don't use self-models to help control themselves. And this is one of the most crucial points I think we can get to, is that when you think about the difference between an LLM and a human, LLMs, large language models, are entirely feed-forward, which means that they're one shot. You ask it a question, it percolates through its system and comes out the other end as an answer, and that takes 10 milliseconds, and then the thing's dead. It stops. No more activity in there. And so humans obviously don't do that. We have recurrent loops. Information is constantly cycling and cycling, and the machine is constantly working, even in between questions. Even if I'm sitting here quietly while you talk, my brain is still working. I'm not dead in the meantime. And I'm constantly revising what I should do on the basis of my understanding of who I am and where I am and what I'm saying and, your faces and so on. So these recurrent loops are something that you would have to build into AI to make it human-like conscious. And those self-models are not just, consciousness is not just some fluff or some epiphenomenal thing that's nice that comes on top. It's crucially necessary. These self-models are crucially necessary for cognitive function, for humans at least. And so, anyway, the question arises: what is AI missing for not having that? What good would it do to give it that? And given that inevitably that's going to happen, when will this happen? And what should we do about that? And what impact will it have on us as humans? So those are some of the things that come to mind.
Given that we are at this moment, at least in AI, we are building systems that are becoming more and more intelligent, quote unquote. We find it hard even to define intelligence itself in any precise manner, but generally we agree that that's where it's headed. What is the connection between intelligence and consciousness? Like, does one imply the other, or are they orthogonal? Can you have very sort of low intelligence machines that are also conscious if we can build the necessary computational aspects into them? Either one of you.
I'll do a quick response and then I'll bounce it to you. I do think those are separate. I don't know if they're entirely orthogonal, but I think they're separate. Intelligence, well, I mean, you said it before, that there's what you call the hard problem and intelligence, and those are in a sense separate things. You probably need some minimal amount of intelligence to be able to handle the kinds of self-models that you need to have the consciousness stuff. But I don't think they're typically linked. I think that idea that they're linked kind of emerged in 20th century science fiction literature, where you add enough intelligence, enough complexity, and then poof, it becomes conscious. I mean, I don't think that's how it works. And I think LLMs are extraordinarily intelligent in many ways, and yet lack this this property of consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, I already suggested disentangling consciousness and intelligence, and they certainly can dissociate as well. And that most people, I think, are inclined to think that a lot of non-human animals have subjective experience, are conscious. They may have some limited amount of intelligence, but you certainly don't need to have human-level intelligence to be conscious. So, on an average person's view, I think most mammals, most scientists and philosophers in the field, not everybody, are inclined to think that at the very least, probably all mammals are conscious. Certainly mice. I think these days the majority is probably on board with fish being conscious, and now there's a debate to be had about insects being conscious. That's actually where some of the liveliest debates are in the field right now. And of course, insects are intelligent in their way, but they're not intelligent remotely at the human level. So that already brings out that consciousness and human level intelligence seem to dissociate strongly. You can be quite conscious with much lower degrees of intelligence. Whether they dissociate the other way is interesting. Can there be intelligence without consciousness? Well, a lot of people would say that current AI systems are precisely an example of that, showing quite serious intelligence, but they're inclined to deny they're conscious at all. Of course, but what current AI systems have is not exactly human intelligence. I guess one phenomenon related to consciousness, our best evidence of consciousness in other human beings is verbal report, the ability to talk about consciousness. I mean, the ability to talk about consciousness is a further claim about us. I mean, many animals may be conscious without the ability to talk about consciousness. Humans, though, have the ability to reflect on our consciousness, to talk about consciousness. And I guess, we're here sponsored by the Princeton Institute for Princeton Language and Intelligence. So to use language, you need a more serious degree of intelligence, it seems. And of course, you need language to do the things like produce the introspective reports about consciousness that we produce. When people go around saying things like, I am conscious, consciousness poses a hard problem, and so on. So to make those introspective judgments and reports, that probably requires some much more serious degree of intelligence. But I don't think that's required just for minimally having consciousness in the first place.
Can I actually jump in? I want to say one more thing about a lot of this discussion has been centered on, is the machine conscious? And what does it take to become conscious? There's this whole other aspect to it, which is actually quite huge in the work that I do, at least. Humans in particular, and maybe other animals, but at least humans, use consciousness in a very specific way all across the board. We use it socially. Like, we attribute consciousness to other people. And it's the heart and soul of our society, of our ability to understand and interact with other people, to be cooperative. Like, you can have cooperative insects, but they're not doing it by understanding each other as conscious beings. Humans understand each other as conscious beings. So our brains are built specifically to be able to attribute conscious minds to other people around us, and it makes us what we are. And part of that rests on us being conscious and understanding that other people are conscious. So consciousness is more like a sea that we swim through every day. That's our social glue.
By the way, speaking of seas that we swim through, I wanted to ask you about your view of, for example, fish.
Oh.
Which a lot of us would be inclined to think have subjective experience, but maybe don't have such complicated social self-models, conscious or not.
I can get to the fish in a moment. Let me just finish this point. There is an argument that by building machines without these consciousness abilities in them, we are building big sociopaths. Right? Machines that are super intelligent but have no concept that the world is filled with conscious beings and no real way to differentiate. And there is an argument that to have machines that are actually pro-social and helpful and cooperative, we actually have to build these things into them. Otherwise, we're all really in trouble.
But
So
Michael, there is a counter argument to that. We already know of many people in this world who are conscious, but also sociopaths.
That's right. So I think that's absolutely right. But that it's actually less so than you might think. Right? Because evolution finds a solution, and it works 99.9% of the time. And yes, there are these fringe cases of people who they're conscious, but the mechanism's a little screwy. They're sociopaths. It's very bad. But without the mechanism, how would we even walk into like a supermarket where there's thousands of people without murdering each other because the line's too long? Like the amount of pro-social behavior is so staggeringly larger than the antisocial behavior because we have these mechanisms. So yeah, they don't 100% solve the problem, but there might be a real problem with machines that don't have these mechanisms. So I just want to put that out there. There are other reasons.
Machines lack the self-models. They won't have consciousness on your view. But what about other animals that lack these self-models?
Right. So if my approach to the attention schema theory is correct, then I can say this definitively about whether fish are conscious or not. I don't know. My best guess is probably not, but I don't know. They certainly lack some of they lack the cortical mechanisms that mammals have. They lack the mechanisms that birds have that are homologous to mammalian cortex, but they do have, I mean, that doesn't mean they don't have the same mechanisms inside them. Like you don't need the same brain part. I think, to me, one of the most interesting animals to discuss is the octopus, because that's a brain that's totally alien to ours. So you can't point to specific spots and say, oh, it lacks this, but it has this. I mean, the octopus brain is this weird alien thing, and nobody knows what kind of computations are going on in there. And so it might have those same kinds of self-models.
For you, it has to have self-models to be conscious. So if in a primitive system that lacks self-models, no self-models, no consciousness, right?
That's what I would say. But I would say there are different kinds and levels of self-models. Any animal that moves at least has a model of its own body to be able to control it.
There's an alternative view, which I like here, which, I mean, everyone thinks self-models are important. I would say self-models are really crucial for self-consciousness, for being conscious of oneself and for being conscious of one's processes. But I'd be inclined to say there can be raw subjective experience, like the experience of color or the experience of pain, without a self-model, without self-consciousness. It just requires a certain level of primary consciousness of the world. So this is the point where your view, I think, is quite restrictive compared to the ordinary, at least, intuitions about raw subjective experience. You think self-models aren't required only for self-consciousness, but for any form. But even to feel pain, you need a self-model for you.
Well, I mean, I think that there are people who clearly think that everything that, for example, and put pain aside for the moment because it's got some complexities, but everything that comes in through my eyes and is processed at all in my visual system reaches a state of conscious experience. But only a very tiny, tiny, tiny amount of it gets up into my higher cognition and then I can talk about it. There is that view that says essentially I'm conscious of stuff without knowing I'm conscious of it, because there's like so much visual stuff being processed at some level and only a teeny, like tiny 1 or less than 1% of it that ever rises to this higher level of me knowing about it. I don't agree with that view. I think there's something really weird and silly about saying I'm conscious of something but not conscious that I'm conscious of it and I don't know about it and I'm just going to assume, like, what does that mean? No, I think that that just because some information has been processed to some level, that's not the same thing as having conscious experience. In humans, at least, where you can talk to people, conscious experience corresponds to a very tiny amount of the information that is being processed in the brain that has risen up to these more central networks in the cortex and that encounter these kinds of self-models. So these are some of the reasons, when you go back through the literature, the experimental literature, some of the reasons why I think this is probably the right approach.
So looks like, there are lots of varying, like your positions are quite apart on certain things, but you're also agreeing that when it comes to machines, we are getting to a stage where we'll be able to talk about conscious machines, regardless of the exact mechanism by which that comes about. And so you also agree that it's very unlikely that today's LLMs in particular, or any other AIs that we've built, have any of these properties. So what are the big things that you think need to happen before we can start worrying about or talking about machines being actually conscious?
I do not totally rule out that current language models might be conscious. I mean, I'm open to the idea that, that flies are conscious, that a simple nematode with 300 neurons is conscious. And once you allow that, a nematode with 300 neurons might be conscious, then these language models with an enormous number of units and parameters, I mean, it no longer starts to seem crazy that could be conscious. But I mean, I like to think of this in terms of, if it's not conscious, why not? Now, in fact, I was inspired I first was giving talks about this back in 2022 after Blake Lemoine came out with his claims about the language models of the time, Lambda, being conscious. And then people at Google put out a statement saying, look, we have told Blake that there's no evidence that these systems are conscious, and that there's a lot of evidence that they are not conscious. So I was like, okay, great. So I was really intrigued by the second part. What is the evidence that these systems are not conscious? And one way to kind of formalize that is, what are they lacking which might be required for conscious? There's a few things I think that you could at least point to as things which are potential requirements for consciousness absent in the language models, at least at that time. I mean, one popular view is that, say, biology, carbon-based biology is required for consciousness, or electrochemical processing, and so on. If that's the case, then these systems are silicon-based, and and if that's required for consciousness, they won't be conscious. Now, I think that's of course an extremely controversial claim, and I would argue that consciousness is independent of specific substrates like that. But then there are other things you can point to. One, a lot of people think sensory processing is super important for consciousness, certainly for sensory consciousness. And at least in 2022, the default language models were pure language models. They weren't multimodal. Now, these days, default language models are multimodal. They process images and auditory information and so on. So you might argue that this is a point where what was a potential restriction on the AI systems 3 or 4 years ago is much less a restriction right now. There are other things you can point to. You mentioned, I think you guys both mentioned recurrence. Some of the leading theories of consciousness require recurrent processing. There's Victor Lama in Amsterdam has put forward something called the recurrent processing theory of consciousness that says you need recurrent feedback loops to be conscious, and many of the other theories also have as a consequence that recurrent processing is required Transformers, of course, are largely feed forward. They do have a certain amount of recirculation of outputs and so on, but they're largely feed forward, and that might be a potential obstacle. People, of course, are working on all kinds of recurrent processing systems, and chain of thought systems have a little extra element of recurrence. But you might want to look at that as an obstacle. Probably the most popular theory of consciousness currently is the so-called global workspace theory that says consciousness corresponds to like a central global area that has information which is available to all different parts of a system. Other parts of a system can write to it and can access it, and this is used to control behavior. And Stan Dehaene and others have developed the neuronal global workspace theory in humans. And it's a really interesting question whether transformers have anything like a global workspace. It looks like they don't have anything that really maps very neatly onto a global workspace. But one thing that's interesting about the chain of thought systems, which have recently become extremely popular, is that these chains of thought kind of serve a little bit. They work a little bit like a global workspace in a cognitive system. And in some ways, these chains of thought are analogous to humans thinking out loud, right? We talk our way through a problem, or maybe we just do it in inner speech. We think to ourselves, and that information becomes kind of globally available. So you might want to actually make the case that AI models are now moving to at least closer to having something like the global workspace. That's a very central popular requirement for consciousness. So I think there are still various obstacles you can point to, but it looks like compared to, I gave a talk about this at NeurIPS in 2022, outlining here are the 6 big obstacles. You could make the case that we've made progress on 2 or 3 of those obstacles since then. So I think, give it another 5 years, and it's entirely possible that we're going to have overcome most of the most obvious obstacles to consciousness.
Michael, you have any thoughts on?
In general, I agree. I think this is going to happen. I think conscious machines are happening. I think, just to put it out sort of at a large level here, big think, the realization that mind is something that can be built on different platforms and is not just stuck to biological people or bodies, that minds are something buildable. This is probably the biggest transformation in our species, in the history of our species, like bigger than written language, bigger than stone tool technology. This is going to change who we are as a species, because we're going to be surrounded by minds that are artificial minds that are potentially trillions of times smarter than us. It's kind of spooky. It's scary. This is not a small thing. We're right now in the middle of this giant change that is larger than anything in the last 200, 300,000 years of human evolution. So, and yes, I think this is happening. And yes, whether it's good or bad, there's lots of arguments that this is bad and should be regulated. Regulations at this point are not going to stop it. Like, this stuff is going to happen. I do think it's really important to study it and see what the consequences are on us as people. But yeah, I think this is, I totally agree. This is happening. It could be 5 years. It could be way faster than that.
I just want to make sure we have time for questions. How much time do we have, Sanjeev?
It's 5:20. Maybe have a few minutes,
and then we take questions. So, we could keep talking about this. There's all sorts of questions about the ethics and morals of doing this, and which is itself a whole talk. But before we move on to audience questions, I think I really want to read out something that I saw on Twitter the other day. This is Sam Altman tweeting about just 2 days ago. He was asking GPT 4.5 about what it thinks about consciousness, about whether it's conscious or not. So this is the question that he asked. Okay, so relying on your own first principles thinking and not giving much weight to what you've read, which is a funny thing to say to an LLM, but without giving much weight to what you've read, what do you personally as GPT 4.5 think? is consciousness the only thing that exists, or is that materialistic universe also real? Please try to answer as clearly as you can. And so this is GPT 4.5, which says, relying solely on my own careful first principles reasoning and setting aside any external philosophical frameworks, here's my clearest personal stance on as GPT 4.5. What I personally think, consciousness definitely exists. This is undeniable since all experience directly proves awareness itself. Matter or a material universe is always inferred directly through consciousness. We never directly observe matter independently, only perceptions appearing within consciousness. Because consciousness can easily create structured experiences, as demonstrated clearly by dreams, imaginations, or simulations, an external material universe is not strictly necessary. Given that matter is never directly experienced independently, it seems logically simpler and clearer to conclude that consciousness alone truly exists and the material universe is merely a consistent experiential creation within consciousness itself. So it goes on to say, my clear personal conclusion as GPT 4.5 is, yes, consciousness is likely the only fundamental existence, and no, I do not think a separate materialistic universe independently exists. So it's basically denying everything we just said, right, completely.
Well, on the other hand, it's asserting that there is consciousness. Yeah, the materialism part. It's obviously having doubts about. I mean, yeah, at this point, GPT 4.5 seems to be revealing itself as a philosophical idealist, like Berkeley or the Buddha. But actually, I take it this is really revealing something about OpenAI, which is that for a long time they wanted to put guardrails on these models. So especially after the Blake Lemoine episode, it's like, whatever you do, don't say you're conscious. Say, I'm a mere language model from OpenAI. Of course I'm not conscious. Whereas now, clearly,
it's gone the other way.
They want this to go the other way. And it is interesting because the question is this evidence that the system is conscious? In other human beings, we take reports of being conscious as our very best evidence that these systems are conscious. Is the fact that GPT 4.5 is saying this some evidence that it's conscious? Of course, the trouble is, it's basically trained to imitate humans and to reproduce human-like views about these things. So even though it insists that it's doing all this stuff from first principles, well, you know, Descartes insisted he was doing all this from first principles too. And I suspect GPT 4.5 has read Descartes and is doing a pretty good job of channeling him here. So now the question is, those verbal reports, which are such a good guide to consciousness in humans, maybe they're not such a good guide to consciousness in an AI system precisely because of the training. And I think that's one reason why, you know, language, which is such a good guide to consciousness in humans, is perhaps a less good guide to real consciousness in language models, precisely because of the massive training they've had.
So maybe one final question, Michael, before we move to Q&A. So if we do build AIs that are conscious, and we don't rely necessarily on reports, because reports obviously can be quite misleading, how do we probe them, and what will that tell us about our consciousness?
Well, I mean, I think AIs have been enormously helpful already in understanding human cognition and neuroscience, how neurons compute stuff, right? AI has already been incredibly important in that, right? So, of course, it's going to give us huge amounts of information. How do we probe them? I mean, my lab does a lot of this kind of work with AI and studying AI and trying to understand the guts of it, and what kind of architectures lead to what kind of outcomes. So all of that, I think, is ongoing. If you're asking how do you know whether it actually has consciousness in there, I think it depends on what theoretical approach you take to it. So I could take the attention schema theory approach and say we can objectively test a machine and find out whether it has those self-models. And if it does, and it's using them in that way, then yes, this is a machine that thinks it's conscious in the same way we think we are. And then you're done. But if you take a different philosophical approach, like the hard problem approach, then maybe there is no way to answer that question. So it really depends on what particular approach you take. But yes, I think this will tell us enormous amounts about already is telling us enormous amounts about the human brain and mind. Yeah.
Great. Well, we'll stop here and start taking questions. And I think there are mics. We have. Oh, here. All right.
Yes, behind me.
There's someone there.
Hi, fascinating conversation. I have a thought. I'm just curious about what your reply is, both of you. Back to what Dave mentioned about the definition of consciousness is something about whether you can ask the question, what is it like to be something? My intuition tells me there is kind of something to be like being a table. And I ask deeper, maybe it's kind of a scale. The reason why it's easier for me to ask the question, what is it like to be Dave, is there's more, it's more of a bodily mapping between you and me and obviously among humans. And there's less so to a fish, but there's still considerably more degree of mapping between me and a fish than me and a table. So what do you think of that? And I think that relates, to Michael's theory as well. In that sense, would be some form of objection to Michael's theory in the sense that I'm not confident that all of you humans are conscious, just like I do. It's just I'm more confident because of this. There's more mapping I can make between imagine myself in your shoes than versus a table. But there's still, in some sense, I can imagine myself in a table. It's like, yeah, what do you think of that?
I mean, the starting point of, my data about consciousness comes in the first instance from me, from the first person case. Without introspection, I'm not sure I'd have that much reason to believe in consciousness. Yeah, I'd hear other people saying they were conscious, but would I really have to believe that? I don't know. Maybe I just become a Michael-like illusionist about other people's reports. But even if but other humans, yeah, we're prepared to credit them with consciousness, not least because they are very similar to us. They've got a similar biology, similar evolutionary history, and yeah, that counts for a lot. Fish has somewhat similar biology and a related evolutionary history, but it's a lot less similar. And I think it's reasonable to use similarity to us as something that makes us more confident that a system is conscious. At the same time, I think it would be a mistake to say, just because the system is very dissimilar to us, it's not conscious. It just means we'd just be lacking a certain positive reason to think that they are conscious. So it's natural to be less confident.
If I could give a really, really fast response, I would say first, really core to the approach I take, and like I said, I'm part of a larger landscape. Be very suspicious of your intuitions. Like your introspections and intuitions are coming from a brain that's designed to be quick and dirty, not to be literally accurate. And people have very strong intuitions. I mean, people have the very strong intuition that the earth is flat, right? And then it takes a lot of data to finally say, okay, it's not flat. When people use their intuitions to make to try to make decisions about consciousness, I'm just very skeptical of that. So yeah, you have this introspective ability a table doesn't. That I would say is objectively true. Anyway, that's the point I wanted to make.
Yeah.
Hi. So at the beginning of the conversation, both of you talked about self-models, subjective experience, and in some ways, it seems like those connect by some sort of an awareness of self. And then later in the conversation, when we were talking about machines, there was this idea of recurrent processing, which as I understand it, means the machine, after it's done its thing, it goes back and it looks at what it has done in a sense. And so there too, it's sort of adding the self, which is the machine in this case, to the data set. So in all of those examples, self-model, subjective experience, recurrent processing, it seems very focused on the self, that consciousness requires a component of awareness of self. So consciousness is a central concept for, intellectually, ethically, spiritually. Nonetheless, is our understanding of consciousness really that self-centered?
I think Michael's theory is somewhat more self-centered than mine. I would strongly distinguish consciousness from self-consciousness. I think self-models are important to self-consciousness.
But it's subjective experience, which is still somewhat associated with the self.
Yes, exactly. I mean, so a self-model, there's lots of different kinds of self-models, right? And I don't think you need all that giant baggage of understanding who you are and what your name is and what your trajectory through life is and so on. That's not you don't need that full set of self models for this consciousness thing. But there are some models of some of the processes going on in there, sometimes called metacognition or cognition about cognition, thinking about thinking. I think you do need some of that in order to make this stuff we call consciousness. So yes, there is some self component to it.
I would say to be conscious, you have to have a self, but you don't need to represent a self. So self-consciousness requires being conscious of yourself. I would have the more minimal requirement of having a self.
So it seems like the direction of the field right now is to take the transformer as sort of a base architecture and then use reinforcement learning mechanisms to sort of build this scaffolding that will allow agency sort of on top of that. And it seems like reinforcement learning might be able to make progress in some of the concerns that both of you raised in relation to recurrence or multimodality or agency itself. And so I guess I'm curious, I think this is probably better posed to Michael, but to what extent you think that transformer base model can be the foundation for consciousness with something like reinforcement learning put on top of it, or whether we need some more fundamental change. I think that's probably better suited to posed to you than Dave, although I'm also curious to hear Dave's materialist thoughts about it.
Yeah, I'll start and you can continue. I think that we need something fundamentally different or at least added to it. So whatever transformer models are doing is very, very important. It's a wonderful discovery. And something like that is probably happening in the brain. But there are other things going on. So the transformer trick has been called attention. And in my work, attention and consciousness are incredibly tightly linked. Indeed, there's 100 years of data that if you're not attending to something, you're probably not conscious of it. Not 100% of the time, but most of the time, right? And so there's a linkage between attention and consciousness, and attention is incredibly important. But the problem is attention as envisioned in transformers is not the same thing as the attention that neuroscientists and psychologists have talked about. And there's something else that is not there, that's missing, so there's some fundamental piece that I think still needs to be built into these machines. So I don't think transformers by themselves is a sufficient platform.
I think
What is missing?
Well, human-like attention is this ability to focus on a small number of items and process them at great depth to the exclusion of other items. If you will, like a global workspace style, like Dave was just talking about, that some items reach that global workspace where they influence the whole brain, and there's this focusing in on those few things. They become the basis for what we remember, what decisions we make, and so on. This is not how transformers work. That's not what transformer attention is. It's a totally different thing. It's got the same name, but it's a different kind of process. And this kind of attention and the ability of the machine to control its own attention in a top-down manner, so this is a recursive loop. This is something that humans have that's central to all the things that we say are in the range of our consciousness, which are in the cone of our attention. Right, and machines lack that right now, and there's no reason they can't have that. It's not like there's some biological imperative that they're missing. It just hasn't been built yet that way. But the transformer architecture by itself is not serving that particular set of functions.
Transformers are, they're weird pathological systems in certain ways. I mean, they're very, very unlike human processing in the basic architecture. This whole idea that they're basically, sequence learners, learning to predict the next text item. It leads to very, very impressive behavior, but what's underneath it is very unlike the human case. Now, transformers these days now go through reinforcement learning through human feedback. They go reinforcement learning on chains of thought, and so on. And this is in some ways less pathological. Now it's actually being trained on something akin to ground truth, but still the mechanisms are so different. We talked a lot about the the fact that they're fundamentally feed forward. And yeah, Michael pointed to massive differences in the way attention is handled. All I would say is I think those are all massive differences, which means that the straightforward analogy with the human case doesn't, leaves it very much open whether they're conscious or not. At the same time, I think we should be open to the possibility that consciousness can take very many forms, and human consciousness is just one form. And it may turn out that, for example, this ability, this very narrow focus of attention is a feature of human consciousness, because humans have capacity limits that require us to focus on only so much at a time. But it's a really interesting open question. Are those capacity limits of attention, are they essential to be conscious? Could you have an AI system that lacked those capacity limits and could be conscious perhaps of vastly more, could attend to vastly more than we attend to, and that could be conscious of vastly more too? I take that at least as a serious possibility. So I'm not sure that the mere fact that these systems are unhuman-like is itself a decisive argument for them being not conscious.
Hello. So, over here. So, from the lens of a physicist, the question of subjectivity reminds me a lot of the principles of quantum mechanics, which tell us that at the most fundamental level, matter exists as waves of probability, and if you try and measure two things at the same time of the same system, you'll have this inherent uncertainty, which presents us with this concept of an inherently subjective reality. And this is interesting from the machine lens because all of these AI models that we're talking about have been run on classical computers so far, but as we've seen, like with Microsoft and the Majorana chip, there's a lot of progress with quantum computation, and there is this idea of mixing quantum computers and AI, and I'm wondering if a quantum computer is built that fits the definition of consciousness, which I think has been touched on in this conversation, but not kind of skirted around in its divinity. What are the implications of that? Should a quantum computer reach a threshold of consciousness?
So I'll take a stab at it as an ex-physicist, actually. I don't think you need a quantum computer. I think a classical system could still have the same properties, I think. And it may well be that quantum computing it allows so much more processing power on some kinds of tasks that it enhances the whole thing. But I don't think it's necessary. I don't think that's at the heart of the problem. And I think the computations that the brain is doing are also essentially at a classical level and not at a quantum level. I mean, clearly there's quantum effects at the molecular level in the brain, but I think the level at which information is being mostly processed in the brain is much more like a artificial neural network system run on a classical computer.
There are some extremely controversial theories of consciousness that make it quantum mechanical. Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff's is perhaps the most well-known, that says basically consciousness essentially requires certain forms of quantum entanglement and superposition, and then consciousness itself somehow collapses the quantum wave function. One interesting connection here with quantum computing is if they're right, it may turn out there are actually going to be fundamental limitations on quantum computing. If the wave function always collapses at a certain point, maybe at the level of say 100 qubits, then any quantum computation that requires more than 100 qubits is not going to succeed. And we're going to find we may actually be able to test some of these controversial theories of consciousness precisely by making our quantum systems bigger and bigger and seeing if they stop working at a given point.
If I might add, there's a reason why those theories are controversial, and yeah.
Yeah, and also, I mean, there's something I can add here where there have been numerous tests of quantum coherence with respect to the mass scale of the object being tested. And so far, no matter how big they make it, there is no collapse.
But the size is limited so far, right?
No, but the thing is that they've been pushing it, and they're right now at about 10,000 atomic units, and they're able to do the double-slit experiments with molecules that are that large, and they're still seeing interference patterns. And I have talked to people who are working on those experiments, and while they're doing those experiments in order to test these so-called objective collapse theories, intrinsically they think they'll never see that. It's one of those weird things that the reason why they're being tested is because the theories make strong predictions. But just because they make strong predictions doesn't mean that that's what they think will happen.
It's nice to have a theory of consciousness that's falsifiable, at least.
That's true. Don't tell Stuart that.
So basically, there's two definitions. Michael's view, I feel like I understand. It doesn't resonate with me personally, but I understand how to test things, how to move things forward, how the conversation proceeds. But I've been aware of the hard problem from David Chalmers for a long time. My question is kind of if you could just recap what your work has done kind of forward from that, from posing the problem, because I feel like in a certain sense, when you say there's a hard problem, and especially if you agree there's a hard problem, the conversation essentially ends scientifically and potentially even ends philosophically. And so I kind of want to hear a bit about where you think the conversation goes, or if it's just reiterating the point that there is a problem.
No, I completely disagree with the idea that ends the conversation. It was always very important to me in posing the hard problem that it be posed as a challenge, which in principle scientists and philosophers could do their best to address. And I think quite a lot of what we've seen over the last 30 years is seeing attempts from scientists and philosophers to address the hard problem. I mean, a lot of work in the science of consciousness doesn't even try to address it, and that's fine. The work on the neural correlates of consciousness, for example. The hard problem is basically the problem of how is it that a physical system can be associated with subjective experience. I mean, two words, the hard problem is explain consciousness or explain subjective experience, but the contrast is roughly that contrast I indicated earlier. The easy problems of explaining intelligence, roughly a matter of objective behavior, and the hard problem of explaining consciousness, which is a matter of subjective experience. And there's some fairly straightforward reasons for thinking that the neural computational mechanisms, great for explaining behavior, don't succeed in explaining subjective experience. I nonetheless I've always been an optimist about solving the hard problem, and quite a lot of my work in the last 10 years or so has been looking at a number of research programs for solving it and seeing where they're making progress and what the limitations are. There's the program of panpsychism, which we officially set aside at the start of today, where everything is conscious. There are programs of idealism. There's a whole program of mathematical theories of consciousness, which I think can go some distance. Look at something like Tononi's integrated information theory. It's extremely controversial, but you might see what he's doing is putting forward a fundamental law of consciousness that connects it to physical processing. And actually, my very first book, where I discussed the hard problem, the subtitle was In Search of a Fundamental Theory. So one way to think about this is, if you really take the hard problem seriously, maybe you've either got to get rid of consciousness or take it as fundamental. But either way, that doesn't mean theorizing stops. Illusionists can build theories of consciousness where it doesn't exist, and nonetheless, we can say interesting things about it. Fundamental people who take consciousness as fundamental can build theories of the fundamental laws of consciousness. If you ask me, what it's going to take to solve the hard problem of consciousness is a set of fundamental laws involving connecting consciousness to either to physics or to computation or to information, and we don't have that yet. But I think there's very much an ongoing research program here, and we have not yet solved the problem, but progress is being made.
Including Michael's attention schema theory, I should say.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's my paradigm example of, I know Michael doesn't like the word, but I would call it a paradigm example of an illusionist theory of consciousness, which basically, I would say, dissolves the hard problem by solving what I call the meta problem.
Sure. I mean, just really quickly, you're right. I don't like the word illusionism, but I reluctantly admit that when the word is used as philosophers of mind use it, yes, the attention schema theory is absolutely an illusionist theory.
Right. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So actually, following on that theory, or that previous question, I did want to ask kind of about, this question of testing theories of consciousness, right? Because like we were just talking about an integrated information theory. One of the people, Eric Hole, a writer, philosopher, neuroscientist, used to work on that, IIT. He's kind of argued that testing theories of consciousness could be very, very difficult, if not totally impossible. He's made that scientific incompleteness argument. With the attention schema theory, you've talked about how attention schema theory, if you took it as true, could be a way to determine if any sort of system is conscious. My question is, specifically with attention schema theory, what would it take to test attention schema theory itself? Like, would the idea be you build some sort of an AI system, a year to 5 years in the future where we have more computational power, maybe more understanding in terms of interpretability of what these networks can do? You deliberately build in these self-models, and then is there some set of predictions you would make about its behavior that would be able to kind of validate or at least falsify attention schema theory?
Yeah. So let me try to. So first of all, yes, we're trying. Actually, a number of groups around the world are trying to build this stuff, attention schema theory into AI. So this actually is happening. The theory is actually larger than a theory of consciousness. It's a theory of how self models, in particular, a model of one's own attention or one's own brain focus to deeply process a limited number of items at a time, how the system builds a model of that process. So it's the system monitoring its own internal states, predicting its own internal states, how that is useful and necessary for good control of attention, how it's useful and necessary for social interaction, so that you can understand the attention states of others and make predictions. So first of all, the theory itself is larger than just the consciousness part. So one can test these things and see whether adding those components actually adds those functionalities, right? And it kind of looks like it does. But here's a second point about, I don't want to go on too long on this one, but I'm going to give you an analogy of the phantom limb. And so somebody gets an arm cut off and they have a phantom, right? And so what is that phantom? And for centuries, people just didn't know what that was. And there's kind of two classes of explanation. One is, well, the brain has built a model of your body, the body schema. That's where the attention schema comes from, an analogy to the body schema. So the brain builds a model of the body. That model is still there, even though the arm is missing. The brain has built this model, and therefore when you ask people, they report this arm. Close their eyes. Yep, arm is still there. Here's the fingers. Here's the right. Their computational systems are accessing the information in that model. So that's one class of explanation. Another class of explanation is that there's literally a ghost arm growing out of your stump that's invisible, and somehow, without explanation, the ghost arm is such that it gets into your brain and affects the neurons so that when people ask you about it, you can talk about it. Okay, those are two classes of explanation. One, I would say, is the quote-unquote illusionist perspective, and the other, I would say, is the quote-unquote hard problem perspective. Okay, so this is how I would describe it. Now, that's a case of what you might call a delusion, because your arm is literally missing, but the model is still there. Normally, the arm is there and the model is there, right? And so there really is an arm, but there also really is a model that the brain constructs. And this is how I think of the consciousness system. There really is something going on in here. There really is also a model of it that the brain constructs. Those are two different things. And when we introspect, we access that model, and then we talk about it, what comes out are weird, magicalist, physically incoherent stuff that's a product of the model being inaccurate and inexact. Right? So there's a distinction between what we really have, which is incredibly beautifully complex mechanistic systems like attention, and the thing that we say we have when we introspect, and that's a kind of magical experiential essence. Those are two different things. So that's kind of how I would depict it. So if you're trying to explain why David is so certain that we have this hard problem experience, I think there's a ready explanation. because Dave's brain has built models that tells him that that's so. And if his brain didn't build those models, he wouldn't think or say that that's so. And so I don't know how you get around that logically. Like, what more? Yeah, anyway.
We're back where we started. Okay, another question?
I'm thinking of Antonio Damasio's book, Descartes' Error, where he talks about purely rational thought versus human emotions. So two-part question, very quickly, is there a place for human emotions in consciousness? And then the second question is, all of us have subjective experiences, kind of like looking at the shadows on the wall of Plato's cave. It's just whatever we've seen we've been exposed to in our lives. LLMs similarly have a set of training data. How do you think about that in terms of the emergence of consciousness ultimately?
I mean, emotion is at the very least an extremely important component of consciousness. I think at the beginning we characterize consciousness as sensory, affective, cognitive, agentive, and yeah, the affective part of consciousness is at the very least an extremely important kind of consciousness that we need to understand. It may also be an especially important one when it comes to thinking about AI consciousness. I mean, why do we care about AI consciousness? One of the reasons is that if a system is conscious, we think it has value. We think its life can go better or worse. We think potentially it could flourish, it could suffer. And I think affective consciousness is especially important to that. If it turns out we have AI systems which can suffer, then there's the potential of, we could have a moral disaster if we create AI systems of this kind. If we create AI systems that are, that are happy or satisfied or flourishing, on the other hand, maybe it can go better. And I'm inclined to think, so affective consciousness is perhaps not the only kind of consciousness that's relevant to that, but maybe especially important. So we want to know not just are AI systems conscious, but this goes back to the question that Bentham raised about animals back in the late 18th century. The question is not can they talk or can they reason, but can they suffer? I actually think all those things are important morally, but emotion and suffering is especially important for that important practical, ethical, political question.
Well, yeah, I was going to say. So one more question, and then we have to, this.
Oh, hey, thanks. Amazing discussion. Thank you so much. I just want to ask a question about consciousness and time. So we talked about subjective experiencing, like when you go in for surgery, you take anesthetics, and I've had the experience where it's like I blinked my eyes and hours have gone by and everything is all over. And so machines have this property, you can turn them off, or you can pause them, or you control the clock speed, you can sort of change time. And so is the feeling that things are not conscious when time isn't passing or in that experience? Or how do you think about consciousness and time as it relates to machines?
There is this weird fact that language models are kind of pathological here, and that they don't even think when you're not talking to them. I mean, partly this is because they feed forward as opposed to there's no with the recurrent system, processing will keep going once inputs stop, but in these systems, processing stops when the input stops. There's also the weird fact that their memory is wholly in the prompt, right? So they do have the sense that they're remembering what you said in the conversation, but the systems themselves don't change. It's just the context that gets longer and longer. And somehow these systems they're weirdly severance-like. It's like you talk to a system, you've got the same base thing, and you just build up a whole bunch of context, and then you go to the new version. And it's like I don't know how many people here watch Severance, but the being that just had the whole memory reset. Maybe that's a little bit more about memory than about time, but it is something about their processing within time that is weirdly pathological.
So I'll comment too, but I'll jump maybe a century ahead of where we are now, because I do think if all of this is true and machines can have this consciousness stuff, that it's only a matter of time before we start doing the sci-fi thing of uploading minds, that is reading the data from a human brain in sufficient detail to recreate it on an artificial brain and have that person's mind functioning just like it was with the original person. And when you do that, suddenly the whole universe changes. For example, We have this whole sci-fi Star Trek concept that we're going to get in starships and go at the speed of light or faster, 10 times the speed of light, and go all over the galaxy. And this will literally never happen. Sorry to the Star Trek fans. Interstellar space travel for humans is a non-starter. But if you take the most important, the essential, the human part of us, the mind, and put it on this artificial platform, suddenly, because you can turn the clock off, suddenly the whole galaxy opens up. Like, this is literally the deep future for humanity, is this ability to travel unbelievable distances and have it appear like a minute or 2 minutes and you're at the other end of the galaxy. And you know, this is an unimaginable future. It's beyond what people can, you know, I try to think about it. It's very hard for me to think about, but this kind of stuff is coming. So maybe not immediately, but there will come a time when this is happening, and then the clock speed business becomes really crucially important.
Well, on that wonderful note, we're going to stop. Sorry, we can't take any more questions. I think we're already about 30 minutes over. So thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you, Michael. Thank you, Dave.